Jesus was Jewish, right? So Christianity and Islam are both sort of, they came from Judaism. So we have a lot of similarities. Jesus was actually a rabbi, he was a teacher, and he had, at the time, I guess you would consider him to be more of like a radical or an outlier, and he felt that Judaism at that time was maybe going in the wrong direction, and he chose to focus on certain aspects of Judaism and to kind of push aside some of the others, but he never actually intended to form a new religion. That was not his plan. That came about after he was gone. His disciples, his main students, were the ones who kind of kept going in that direction to the point of actually breaking off from Judaism. But what's interesting is so much of Christianity and Islam, actually, you can draw the roots back to Judaism pretty clearly. But in Judaism, we enter our children into the covenant at 8 days old, and the whole idea of baptism is kind of entering the child into covenant with God, with Jesus, right? So that is a similarity. And the idea of baptism actually came from a Jewish practice, which was called the mikveh. And in Judaism, there's a practice that went on long before baptism, where Jews would actually immerse themselves in a fresh body of water at certain times for certain things, but it was considered like a spiritual rebirth. And in this day and age, if someone wants to convert to Judaism and become Jewish, they actually go to a body of water. We usually use the ocean, and they will immerse themselves in water, which is basically, that's where baptism came from. So the Jewish people have been around for thousands of years, probably like 4,000 years, and our story is told in those scrolls right there. Every one of those scrolls has, the scroll is called the Torah, and it comes from the word which means to teach. Okay, like a teacher is called a morah, and this is called Torah. So you can hear the similarity. So these scrolls, we happen to have 4 of them. We're lucky. Some synagogues may only have 1. And in poor countries around the world, sometimes they don't even have a Torah. So Jews from other parts of the world will actually buy one for them, because this is the heart of Jewish religion. It's just like the Bible and Christianity. The New Testament is like your heart. It's the core. The Torahs are our core. And every one of these Torahs, even though they're different sizes and they look different on the outside, the words on the inside are identical. And you go anywhere in the world to a Jewish community, you will find in their Torah has the exact same words in Hebrew anywhere you go in the world. This particular Torah right here, this tall one, was actually rescued. It survived the Holocaust. This is a 350-year-old scroll. It was after the war, when Hitler tried to wipe out all the Jews. After the war, some Jews went to synagogues that were still standing throughout Europe. They rescued thousands of Torahs that somehow survived. A very wealthy philanthropist from London had all the Torahs that survived the Holocaust shipped to London, had them all like repaired and cleaned up and everything else, and decided they needed homes in Jewish communities that were vibrant and still alive. And in the 70s, they shipped them out to synagogues all over the world. So there are survivors of the Holocaust, even though the Jews themselves died. Thousands of Torahs were saved and are now being read and loved and cherished in vibrant Jewish communities all over the world. It's like a very cool story. And here at Ramat Shalom, every time a child becomes a bar bat mitzvah, we let them take this scroll and walk out in the congregation and carry it as their own, as a sign of the fact that Hitler failed and that the Jewish people are still very much alive and strong. So that's kind of a cool thing. Read a chapter every week. We read it, and it takes a year to read, and then we start over again. So any synagogue you go to around the world on the same week are reading the same part of the Torah. So it unifies the Jewish people throughout the world. And we have Hebrew as our unifying language. In order for a Torah to be used and be kosher, meaning it's acceptable, every word has to be able to be seen clearly, because we don't want to say the wrong word if the letter gets smudged. So every couple of years, we have inspectors come out, and they actually look at them, and if they go through the whole thing, and if they find any area of it that is smeared or smudged and it's not clear, or there's a tear, they actually will take a section out and repair it and put it back in. So there can't be any mistakes in the Torah, and they do it in sections because they don't have to start over every time. If you notice this thing up here, this kind of relates to the Hanukkah story a little bit. This, and then you see the menorahs. But this up here is called the Ner Tamid. It's an eternal light. And in the great temple, in the ancient great temple, they had a light that would burn at all times. So ours is electric because we don't want to have a fire, and we replace it, but that's called the Ner Tamid, the eternal light. Hanukkah menorah is actually called a Chanukiah, and it's actually pronounced Hanukkah and not Hanukkah, but most Americans can't make that sound. Chanukiah, and Chanukah means rededication in Hebrew. I'll tell you an interesting thing, which kind of addresses what do you think makes Judaism unique. So I'm sure you guys have heard of the Dalai Lama from Tibet. So you know the Tibetan people lost their independence in their country. And the Dalai Lama was very worried about how is he going to keep his people's culture and everything alive when they didn't have any political power. They didn't have their own government, their own way to control things, right? They were very worried that their people would just fade away, which is what happens to most people when they don't have a land, right? A place to call home. It's hard to keep it together when you don't have a home. In the 1980s, he summoned 9 Jewish leaders in the world at that time, to come and meet with him, because he said the Jewish people are the only people that he knew of throughout history that were able to keep their people alive and strong without a homeland, because the Jews were thrown out of Israel in the year 70 by the Romans. They were thrown out twice, once in 586 BCE, or BC, however you want to call it. That was by the Babylonians. Then they eventually came back, and then the Romans, because back then everything was empires, and all these world powers were out conquering everything. So they were thrown out by the Babylonians, and then again by the Romans in 70, and they didn't come back to Israel as a Jewish homeland until 1948. It was almost 2,000 years that the Jews had no home. Jews were living in other countries, and they somehow managed to keep Judaism alive. No other nation in history has been able to do that. So the Dalai Lama was wise. He said, has anyone ever been able to do what I'm trying to do successfully? The only people he knew of were the Jews. So he summoned these Jews to come, and he asked them questions for like a week. How did the Jewish people do it? How did you do it? And one of the main forces that these Jewish leaders shared with him was the use of memory. Memory is such a huge part of Judaism. We, like I said, everything we do, the way we form our synagogues, it's a reenactment of something from Torah. So we never forget our very, very beginnings and everything that's happened in our history. We never forget. A really beautiful example is Passover. I don't know if you've ever been to a Passover Seder, Passover dinner.
Yes, I went with the Whiters.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So we read the story of Passover every year. Every year for thousands of years we've been retelling the story of the Jews being freed from slavery out of Egypt and, gaining their freedom. And we do it using all these symbols. Everything we use at the meal is a symbol in the retelling of the story. So we actually experience physically what it was like. We eat bitter herbs to make, and the hotter it is, the better, because we want to remember the tears of the Israelites who were forced as slaves to work hard labor with no rights and no anything. We actually make ourselves tear and cry as we talk about the story, like it's an all sensory experience. So the Jews shared with the Dalai Lama, one of the really important things you have to do is you have to constantly retell your story, and you have to constantly remember where you came from, and constantly use memory as a way to never forget and to keep yourself strong. So memory is a huge piece for us. We have 4 times a year, we remember those who died, our immediate relatives. So we keep those memories alive. We have a special service on certain holidays where we invoke the memories of those who were closest to us. And then on the anniversary of the death, at once a year, we light a memory candle that burns for 24 hours to constantly remember. Everything we do, the Hanukkah story, we're remembering what happened. Everything that Judaism is about has something to do with remembering. And we keep finding new ways to keep all of that tradition alive and relevant. And so that was the main thing, and I think that's a really unique factor in Judaism, is the importance of memory. It's a huge priority in everything that our rabbis develop to help maintain our religion forever, So that's, I think, one of the really unique factors, and even the Dalai Lama, he called on the Jews, you guys know how to do this, how do you do it? Their number one way, they said, is the use of memory and symbols and traditions that keep those memories fresh and alive in every generation. What do you think? The cantor's job, I told you, I'm in charge of all the music. I want to tell others about our religion. One of the main things in our text and in our teachings is that God asked the Jews to be a light unto the nations, and gave us this very high moral ethical code in the Torah that they wanted us to use, that God wanted us to spread to the world, not to make Jews stronger or more powerful or self-serving in any way, but to make all of humanity better. We're asked to be a light unto the nation. It's called Or LaGoyim. So Goyim are others. Anyone not Jewish is Goyim. Okay, all the nations not Jewish are called Goyim. Or is light. So God wanted us to take the teachings that were given to us in this Torah and spread them to the world. If you study, a lot of constitutional law, a lot of it is based in Jewish text and Jewish sources. There's a lot of things that the Jewish religion brought into the world that didn't exist before that have served humanity up until this day. The idea of the Sabbath, there was never a day off. Every day was the same. People just went through the grind their whole lives. There were no days off. The Sabbath, the idea that even God needed a day of rest, creating the world. If God needed to rest, we're less than God. Of course, we need a day of rest. And that idea that we should have one day every week to reflect and replenish and rejuvenate ourselves was a Jewish idea that did not exist before. A lot of the business law came from the way Jews handled. Back then it was about, your ox or your farm or, it was back then, but the rules applied that there should be justice and that you can't steal and you can't murder. All of that stuff was acceptable thousands of years ago. Humanity was pretty barbaric. And Judaism and Torah brought all of this ethical, moral standing into the world, and God asked the Jewish people to be a light unto the nations. Never about taking over property, conquesting. Never about converting people. Jews do not proselytize. We don't go out, even though we're trying to be a light to the nation, it's by example and by sharing the teachings. Not asking anyone to become a Jew. If somebody wants to become a Jew, great, we welcome you, we're happy to have you. We'll make you study and learn, and if we know you're on board for the right reason, you're in, But we're not out there trying to grow ourselves in that way, but we are asked to be a light unto the nations. It's a different motive, and I think that's really special because most peoples in the world are ultimately concerned with making themselves more powerful. That's never been the Jewish goal. That's not what we're about. We're about making all of humanity better. And I'm proud for that. I'm proud to be a part of a people that's our main goal, is to bring more light into the world and to bring more justice into the world. What happens during Yom Kippur? So I would say if, I know in Catholicism you go to confession. Catholicism goes to confession. You all know what it is. I think you go whenever you want, right?
Yeah.
There's no limit. You can go as many times as you want. So I would say that Yom Kippur is like the annual confession. Yom Kippur is a one-day, it's taught in Judaism that anytime you wrong someone, you should seek forgiveness and try to repair whatever damage was done. All the time, on a daily basis, right? But there's a once a year where the community comes together and does this like giant confessional. We spend the whole day, we don't eat, we don't drink, we stay in synagogue all day, and we, as a community, ask forgiveness for all the sins that everyone in our community has committed. So even if you, I never robbed a bank, maybe somebody in the congregation stole money, white collar kind of crime, like they stole embezzled money or something, which would be like robbery. I haven't done that. But what we do is we come together as a community and we say, you know what? We're all responsible for each other. So whatever sin you committed, it doesn't matter today. Today we're saying we've all done something wrong, and that ultimately we're responsible for everybody, for each other, and that the more we can do what's right and be loving and kind and fight for justice, do all those things, hopefully the less likely people will be to commit wrong. The difference between Orthodox, Hasidic, Messianic, and probably all the others too. Just like I think all religions have this, because again, it's human nature. It's the part of human nature that sucks, is that different people want power and they want to think they're right and you're wrong. So in every religion, there's little splinter groups that come and form because they don't like what they're doing or don't agree with this and they can't figure out a compromise. So they say, okay, we're going to go and start our own. It's happened in Christianity. That's why there's Methodist, Baptist, Episcopalian, whatever, all of the different sects of Christianity. Judaism has that. Islam has it. There's all different groups. So ultimately, Judaism was just Judaism, like back in the day when we received the Torah. We were a small group, we were all together in one part of the world, and we were all kind of doing the same thing, right? But as history moved on and Jews were thrown out of countries and had to go find other places to live and become parts of other societies, we developed sort of different strands based on the circumstances of that particular Jewish community, So the major splits happened when the Jews moved out of the Middle East and went to Europe. And once they got to Europe is when things started to splinter off a lot. And then that came over to the United States as well and South America. But originally there was just one Judaism that was according to Torah. And it was based on this one temple that was central for the entire Jewish world. When the Jews were thrown out of Israel in 70, when the Romans kicked us out, and we never went back again until 2,000 years later, the rabbis came up with this idea, okay, everything in Torah and Judaism, in the Torah was based on sacrificing and all this kind of cultic stuff that went on around the temple in Jerusalem. Well, now that we don't have that temple in Jerusalem, how are we going to keep it alive? We're going to build replicas. Remember I told you memory? We're going to use our memory of the great temple, and we're going to build localized synagogues that can sort of be the temple, like the great temple, for that particular Jewish community. So the synagogue became a localized, smaller version of what was the great temple. Eventually, animal sacrifice and sacrificing went by the wayside, and we didn't have the great temple to do it in a centralized place. So synagogues started sprouting up all over the place, and to this day, there's very small, extreme sects of Judaism that want to rebuild the great temple in Israel and revive Torah Judaism. 98% of the Jewish world has no desire for that, and we agree that it's okay to live in different places and use localized synagogues as replicas. We replace the idea of sacrifice with prayer. No more killing animals. No more burning incense, all that kind of stuff. Now what we do is our offering to God is through our prayer. So prayer, I think, also was probably introduced through Judaism to all the religions.
Go. I really enjoyed the service. When we first walked in, they were very welcoming and knew that we weren't a part of their congregation, but then they welcomed us with open arms. And a lot of it's very similar to Catholic Mass, and we do a lot of praying, a lot of singing, and a lot of the Mass is in Hebrew, which is different, but it was actually very nice to hear another language, and it kind of reminded me about how Catholics used to say things in Latin. So overall, it was a very good experience, and my friend, who's also a member, was with us, so that also helped us a lot since we knew when to stand and when to sit. So,
yeah.
My experience was that I felt really welcomed, and also the minute I walked in, like you could like tell that the energy was different because there was a lot of like singing and there was like a lot of like different kind of praising, and it was just like the people were really nice too. And then like at the end, they were all like, "Oh, like come eat, like have something." And they're like all kind of like open arms to us. And like also in Mass, like they're like, if anyone wants to say anything, like say it. And like it didn't matter if you were like Jewish or not, like they accepted you.